Hello and welcome everyone. Welcome back to the 7th night of Films Representation Film Festival. It's our pleasure to welcome tonight Turkish director Gürcan Ketlek for the first time at Films Representation to present the UK premiere of his second feature, Meteors. Meteors is a film that focuses on a certain Kurdish region of southeastern Turkey, and provides an astute political commentary on the conflicts that that region is still suffering. But it's also a film that deals with the memory, with the belonging, and deploys different languages, different formats. You will see what I mean in a minute. Given the political dimension of Gürcan's work, unfortunately, Gürcan has been advised not to show the film in Turkey. And we would love to hear from him about this aspect, but also other aspects of his working methodologies in a conversation that will take place with Gürcan and Isabel Stevens, production editor at Sight and Sound. And we will, of course, welcome Gürcan back tomorrow for a workshop where we will have the chance to show some of his previous works as well. Please join me in welcoming Gürcan Ketlek.
Hello, welcome to the screening of Meteors. This is the first time we are screening the film in the UK, and it's really exciting. I wanted to thank Nicola for having us here. This film, inspired by the events, took place in 2015, late summer 2015. I will be here after the film, answering your question and talking about the film. I hope you enjoy it. Thank you.
Hello, everybody, and thank you to Gürcan for a fantastic and quite eye-opening film. I wanted to start by asking you a little bit about how you came to the project, because you yourself are not Kurdish or Turkish. I'm interested in how this conflict is represented in Turkey, and yeah, how you sort of came to make a film about this subject.
Yes, I'm not Kurdish. I actually came from Izmir, which is an Aegean town in Turkey. It's in the west. But I like to shoot things where I don't belong to. My previous project was I shot in Cyprus in the buffer zone, and I was actually everything came up by accident. Actually, I was at home and I was sick, and I was watching this. There was this app called Periscope, and during the conflict, people were doing live web streams on Periscope from the southeast, and I started to watch that, and it was really interesting because there was like 1 hour static shots. It was like James Benning film, and one hour shot of there was nothing happening, and but if you look long enough, there was really something really magical thing happening. There was this little girl running, or little boy was screaming, or you could see some woman on the window. And I wanted to make a series of static shots like that during the conflict, and or recreating it in the southeast. And so the idea come up with that. But at the same time, during the conflict, this meteor started to fall, and it ended the conflict itself, because there was huge explosions. Also, people come out from their homes and they started to collect stones and start sell it to NASA. The whole thing was really strange, and I remember that because there was this contrast, and there was lots of civilian deaths, but at the same time people thought that there was army bombing in them, and then they find out that it was meteors. And but another reason I want to make this film, that there was a total blackout in the media, that you don't know what was going on. So I wanted to keep those images in terms of filmic language and protect them. And so I remember taking this note that this stones sent by gods able to stop the war, and I built the whole idea from there. And even though I'm not a believer, I'm agnostic, I really like the idea that old paganic gods sent stones, big stones to earth, able to stop the war. And this is everything starts from that point, actually. So we started shooting. At the same time, we started collecting archival footage. Not only the official archival footage, also with regular people's footage and their own archives. When I look back, right now most of these archives destroyed and it's gone. So I wanted to keep them in inside of filmic universe. This is how I started to film. So we shot, edit, and collected archival images at the same time.
And you say we, did you have is it quite a small operation, your film?
There was only me, Ebru, which is my main protagonist in the film, my editor Fazilet, and there was one cameraman. And there were only 4 of us, actually. We were experimenting, and we had no idea what to do with this structure. We were not sure that if it's gonna end up in a medium-length film or some video work or whatever. But we didn't make too much plans because there was an immediacy we feel, and I believe that things were going on has to be documented in a way, in terms of documentary filmmaking or hybrid, whatever, it has to be protected. This was my main concern about the issue, actually.
And how, was it easy, difficult to access these areas and to also convince people, I guess, as well, particularly as you're Turkish, that that you're making this film and to get them to collaborate with you? And did you know Ebru beforehand, or?
Yes. We shot a short film together, 2012, called Overtime. She's Kurdish. She knows the area very well. I mean, her family background is also very political, and her father is part of one of the main Kurdish parties in Turkey. But at the same time, she's an actress, and she studied opera, and she's writing novels, and she's very talented. And she kind of understands that she's gonna play herself, but at the same time, the whole construction of the film would be something like fiction. So we didn't talk about these issues, actually. We just go and do it. And then, of course, when we do the editing, we sit down and write the narration together, because she's a brilliant writer. And I wrote down these voiceovers, and then we used some cut-ups from her first novel, which is called The Vaccine. It was about some kind of underground literature novel, and about the same issue.
And I suppose having her on board, did that help other people sort of to open up to you, and particularly the children, the interview, and the other people in the film?
We got thrown out few times in the neighborhoods because it was protected by the army. They didn't want filmmakers or news channels to capture images. And once I succeed to sneak in, but the most important interviews come from Barış için Kadınlar, Women's Initiative for Peace.
Okay.
And this collective is a group of women, scientists, artists, writers, and somehow they managed to get in like 45 minutes or so, an hour or so, and they captured some of these interviews, and it was, I think it was a great footage, and it helped me a lot. And the most important thing is that they released this footage anonymously, and there was no credits, no GOP, no director, whatever, and they just edit it and put them together.
And they do that because there might be repercussions against them?
They do that because they want to let people know what's going on. Nobody was doing it. I mean, those times were really strange that there was this complete blackout was going on, but we were hearing news channels within the channels of social media, and there were violent deaths, and that affected us a lot. And but Women's Initiative for Peace somehow managed to capture the spirit of those few months, actually, because people trapped inside, they couldn't go out, and at the same time, I was not convinced or satisfied with my own footage. That's why I went to them and asked for the additional footage.
And they were happy to take parts?
I mean, they somehow, I mean, some of them seen the film and they like it. Some of them refused to see it because, they are not thinking that it could be useful for a film. And I don't know, actually. I mean, I have a friend, Gülis Sağlam. She's also a brilliant documentary filmmaker. And most of the time, she was behind the camera. When I explained to her what kind of structure I'm trying to do, she opened her archive, and it was great.
And so the structure of the film, obviously, it's pretty... it's very interesting and kind of diffuse in a way. How did you have sort of in mind a kind of idea? You know, did you think, oh, I'll start with the kind of eclipse and the the mountains and end up back there at the end, or did that kind of come out sort of more organically from the process?
I started to shoot the goats, mountain goats, a few years back, actually, because they were really interesting creatures. They are really rare. They are really hard to shoot down, and there's only every year 3 weeks of they're opening for hunting season. But there was also I choose the goats I used the goats in the film because there was this similarity between Kurdish guerrilla and the goats. They only come down in the few weeks in the summer when the snow melts. This is how they got hunted by the army. Otherwise, they cannot catch them. It's impossible. They are mostly in highlands and. But I didn't use all of these elements as a metaphor. Actually, it was physically and practically. It was a fight, and it was a war about landscape itself. Turkish army was saying that they were defending themselves because Kurdish guerrilla was digging trenches and putting bombs over there. So there was a real fight about landscape was going on, and when you look at that landscape, the animals and humans are part of it, and they are living there like thousands of years. And so I thought that, I felt that those rare creatures are very similar to Kurdish community in the southeast, because there's this territory. You see, when you look at the map, there's this territory that it started with the, as you've seen in the film, at the end, it started with the Mount Nemrut. It's the northern border of the Kurdish territory, and it ends with the Syrian border. And the whole meteors started to fall within this big region, and it wasn't like in one city or one town. It was spreading all around. So I shot all of these things separately, but then I sit down and I write down some kind of sequences, and I decided to use chapters, and because there was this fragmentation within the footage itself that you only see in fragments, you don't have the whole picture of what's going on. So it's really, for me as a filmmaker, it's really fit with the theme itself. and it all become together unconsciously at the same time, because I decided, we were keep joking that it's not a documentary, it's a psychedelic documentary. It's not that we are not, I mean, I'm not a purist documentary filmmaker. I believe that everything you do is a kind of manipulation, enabled to tell your own story, or, you know, whatever you are telling. So even though everything you've seen on front of the camera, it's real, but the way you construct the film itself, we work like we are working on a fiction film.
Mm. And when did you decide sort of to bring in the monochrome? Was that right from the beginning, or because it's kind of like, so it really changes the footage, because you can't really distinguish where it's always from. Whereas I think if it was in colour, you would be like, oh yes, that is kind of footage from maybe that, you know, kind of news footage or CCTV footage and that kind of thing.
It was not a new decision for me. I work with black and white with my previous film. I shot my first short film on 8mm black and white, and then I've done this medium length on black and white again. Of course, there are these typical aspects of black and white that it gives you this timeless, you know, feeling when you watch it on a big screen. But for me, the most important part was that these low-quality videos work really well with the high grains, high-resolution grain on. We were experimenting during the post-production, and it works really well. It also reflects the idea of the footage of the guerrilla and the army itself, because they are usually low-quality video. They never shot on HD or something. Of course, both sides using as a kind of I don't like the word propaganda, but they use it as a tool of the conflict itself. But they were all low quality, and I wanted to experiment with that. Because when I look at the documentary filmmaking, everything become more and more polished, and you know, so I tried to use this low quality as a narrative itself, actually. Even though you don't know what's going on the screen, you see some shadows and some people's figures, and they run. You hear some of the radio talk, but you cannot tell if it's Turkish or Kurdish, and you cannot tell what are they talking about. So I mixed all of these elements, enabled to tell the audience this uncertainty of late summer 2015 in the southeast.
Yeah. I like how particularly how the perspective often changes. Sort of like 1 minute you're right in the middle of things, and then the next minute there's sort of this distance, and you're looking back on the city, and it's sort of like tiny. And even within sort of shots themselves, you're kind of like, I think there's that image of the shattered glass car window or something, and kind of after looking at that, after say seeing some of the kind of amazing cosmic skyscapes, that both of them kind of the images sort of bleed into each other in really interesting ways. I guess that's like, there must be something you sort of brought out in the editing.
We edited many sequences, and we cut them all during the editing. I mean, we edited like 3 hours or something. Then we decided that it didn't work. I mean, as a duration, then we get rid of them. But I like this playful element when you watch the film. It keep jumps between things, because all of these events were happening at the same time. There was this conflict going on. There was meteors was falling. There's this character in the film. I don't like to call it character, actually. She's a person. She's a real person. And again, it was not conscious. Whenever we see something we think it's a good idea, we go and do it. And we haven't calculated anything. but of course using episodic structure, and helped us a lot. And but all of these elements also related to how we remember the event took place in 2015. I believe where I come from, in my country, people remember things in a strangely distorted way. They remember things, but they are not accurate, as we've seen in the film.
So, like, and this film obviously hasn't been shown in Turkey, as you said at the beginning. No. And that's because you've been advised against showing it there, and it won't be shown in the areas where the film takes place.
Actually, when I started working on this film, until the conflict, there was this peace process, I must say, and everything. I mean, there were things were being discussed on TV and the media, and among ordinary folk, and it was not a sensitive subject for a period like 3 years or something like 3 years. But everything changed afterwards, after I finished the editing of the film. So I never thought this film could be a trouble for us. It's still not. Actually, I advised later. First, I banned myself because I wanted to continue to produce films. I didn't want to. I'm just a filmmaker. I'm just. I mean, I thought that okay, we could show it 2 years later. Then it's not a big deal. That's why I made the decision. And we also thought that if there will be a court case or something, we can't afford it. Because we spent all of our money in the film. And so it was a practical decision. And yeah. For me, I mean, the films look like a film about a conflict, but for me, it's a very personal film. So the reasons I made this film, that the things were really personal for me. So I just don't want to deal with this political fight. I don't want to be. Also, I believe that this kind of films, like. Between documentary or fiction, whatever people would like to call, there's an audience for that, and you could meet with the audience. You could go to London. Just before London, we screened the film in Tehran, in Iran. So you could meet with the audience. I don't think that, I don't have any romantic ideas to screen this film in Turkey and Kurdistan, and I'm sure we will screen at some point, but maybe not now.
And is that why you picked to sort of show the film at a festival like this, that obviously has more of a kind of sort of art documentary, you know, sort of interrogates documentary, rather than, say, a more politically minded festival where the sort of tagline of your film would be, "Oh, this film is about."
True.
Yeah.
Yes, let me give you an example. I told my colleagues and the sales agent that I don't want to screen at Dop like Leipzig, because I know that which context they're gonna take, you know, the whole, you know, meaning of the film. So there is this danger that when you do something, also there's this danger when you make a film about a subject which is still going on. There's a danger of you said some things in the film that you say too early, and I'm always cautious about that, because this conflict is still going on, and it's spread to Syria right now, and
then your film kind of gets tied to that one topic, and is that sort of...
Yes, because I want to make a landscape film, actually. I mean, when you look at the landscape, there's this landscape war going on, that there's this state, and there's this community, and there's this guerrilla inside of this community, if I talk in a simplistic way, that there's this fight going on about the landscape, and this film, for me, it's about landscape, but it's also about control. Everybody wants to take control of some neighborhoods and some city or some landscape, but nobody could take a control. I think these subjects are also very universal. It's nothing to do with Turkey. I mean, you could go anywhere in the world, and you could, if you look at the history, you could see that.
And is that why, I mean, at the end you show these statues, so you, I mean, obviously the kind of sort of time is brought in with the subject of the meteors and the eclipse at the start, but obviously very specific, like human time is kind of referenced at the end. It's kind of a very interesting end to the film. I wonder if you could talk a bit more about that.
As I said, I did not calculate the ending of the film. All I say, I was telling to my editor that the last 10 minutes has to be dialogue-free, and we have to go back to goats again. And this is what I wanted. Because I want to show the audience that, yes, they are getting killed, but they are still there. And yeah, I mean, it's... there is this danger of when you want to go with specific narrative, there is this danger that you could drown into the way of telling story, and then the subject itself could be less and less and less important. But when I edit something, I always watch again and again and again, and then there's this unconscious decision that, okay, now it works. I cannot tell why it's work or not, but as I told you that I'm agnostic. I don't believe in God, so but I believe this kind of spirituality in cinema, that I really like the idea of that the gods throw stones in able to stop the war, which it did actually, literally, and then I cannot say healing process, but at least civilian deaths has stopped for like 3 weeks. I think it was very important.
I mean, I found it, I mean, I know you don't want to dwell too much on the political side, but I found it was very shocking. I don't think, I mean, the conflict really isn't covered in this country. I think sort of we know more about the Kurdish situation in Syria than we maybe do in Turkey here. I guess I was interested also the focus that your film has on women and children, which is sort of generally when we think about conflicts and war, is often men who are the focus. And I mean, was that
because
something...
I want to make a female film, because everything about the war is very man-oriented, and it doesn't matter where it is. It's always like, you know, men talking, and but I want to. It was very. We were really strict about that. We're gonna have a female protagonist, and when we talk with people, when we see people, we're gonna see female or children, and that's why we see, most of the times we see women and children in the film. Because when I look at this geography, when I went there, when I was working as an assistant director, I went to Southeast. I was working in some feature film. The whole landscape was really female to me. It was this also this is this spirit. Also, when you look at the Kurdish community, woman is really equal with men, especially with the community as you've seen in the film. So they're really powerful, also in a political context too. Yeah.
One thing that struck me when I watched it is the narrator Ebru talks about poetry and filmmaking being sort of difficult or maybe potentially useless in the sort of face of death, and I was wondering how that reconciles with your film, because obviously you're seeing, I mean, your film is very poetic, and it's sort of making a case for poetic cinema about this subject, which seems to be slightly at odds with what sort of, with her thoughts.
We were trying to balance this thing between this really, really raw footage, unpolished footage, and with the really poetic language. And I believe that that contrast could work well together, because where we shot the film, it was impossible to make a well-calculated film, But I mean, it's even, as I told you, that we got thrown out like 3 times. It was impossible to put the camera and then start thinking about it. And everything was really fast, and we have to be really quick. But when we start recording the voiceovers with her, and we decided to go to that direction, I think it works really well. And also thematically works well with the elements of nature and the elements of territory, all of these things. And if you decide to make a film about Turkish-Kurdish conflict, I believe as a filmmaker it's a good idea to approach this subject with the poetic language instead of being, as you said before, instead of being, conventional way. And she's also being a novel writer. I think this is her language too, and we constructed together. And again, it was really unconscious decision, but for me as a filmmaker, it works well together with that text and really unpolished images.
And was it harder, do you think, to get funding for a film that's sort of maybe more poetic than one that was, say, maybe more overtly political about?
I don't know that, because we never tried to finance it, actually. It's a self-financed film. We were trying to remain under the radar. We don't want people to know. Only time we present the film was in Istanbul Film Festival. There was a work in progress in Meetings on the Bridge. So we were presenting the film to the international jury. So they watched the first hour of the film. But before that, we decided to remain under the radar. So only few people know that we are making this kind of film. But if you ask me, it's impossible. Not that the film has this political layer, just because that film has kind of a documentary funding or fiction funding has their own way to talk about these things when you sit down with people or private financiers or TV channels or whatever you are talking with. And most of the time, sometimes they don't get it, or they follow very popular themes. I have a new project. I'm following the conventional rules of financing right now. But with this one, we decided to, if we do ourselves, and it could be easier. And at the last stage, my Dutch producer involved, and he put some money, and then we managed to finish the film. But I don't know how to pitch this film. Let's say we are meeting with some producer, or I still don't know how to pitch this film, actually.
I noticed, I always look at the thanks in the films. I noticed that Bill Morrison's name was there. Did he play? Was that the filmmaker Bill Morrison?
Yes. I wrote down Bill Morrison over there because Bill Morrison works in the medium of film, which is damaged film or decaying film, but he also interested the idea of the memory and the medium itself and the relationship within. And as a filmmaker, it influenced me a lot, even though he's doing thematically or narratively, he's doing completely something else. But he's so good of digging some archive and finding the impossible. So, and this influenced me a lot, and I wanted to thank him at the credits. And I discovered him later, actually. He was well known. When I discovered him, he was already well known and being watched at the festivals and everywhere. And I believe he's a brilliant filmmaker. And I kind of take the idea of dive into some archive and do completely something else, and it comes from Bill Morrison.
How many archives and different sort of types of footage did you kind of use for this film? I mean, those sort of, I mean, how many hours did you have to spend watching?
Many weeks. We have to watch everything, and we have to separate things between each other. Like, first decision was to not use propaganda images. It doesn't matter where it come from, but my main at that time I was obsessed with the images shot by non-filmmakers. I mean, they were shooting that image, but they don't know that it was really cinematic. So that was really interesting for me. There was like 10 minutes of landscape, and there was this bomb comes up, and but that particular person doesn't know that it's the thing he shot. It's a cinema. There are shots of made by Kurdish guerrillas, which they died later, and there are shots of Turkish army too. So there are official archives too. But I also use very banal cell phone images too, and I made them blow up on screen and mix them with the high grains, and so there was like, you know, whole different diverse sources. We were watching everything and able to. We were thinking if we could use them in the film or not, and the whole thing was an experimentation actually, and it was that. But apart from the content of the film, that part was really it was so much fun to spreading this and that, and deciding on what to use and what we shouldn't use. And I have this ethical decision from the first day one that I don't want to see anyone die on camera, because there were loads of death in front of camera when the footage started to arrive. And even there was this case that we went to Southeast and we shoot something, and then we realized that those people died there, and we made the decision to not to use those images, because I believe in dignity of that, and you don't need to shock people like that in able to tell them a story or some geography or landscape, whatever you want to talk.
I guess you have the testimony of people talking about death, like the mother who talks about her son, and obviously the narrator too, so it's always there. But yeah, I suppose the only really violent act that we see up close is the goat dying at the beginning, which actually is very shocking. Well, I found it very shocking way to kind of enter the film. Yes,
I mean, we are not seeing it, but we could tell that in that moment that he got shot, and yes, this is one thing I'm still questioning myself actually, but every year, I mean, right now it's open for season again, it's happening again. There was this case during Locarno Film Festival, and one person in the audience, she protested us with the violent towards animals in the film, and she left, and but I believe there is a difference. I mean, the violence itself is the same. It doesn't matter if it's towards animals or humans, but I believe there is a difference. To show a little girl dying in front of the camera, or some goats getting hunted by hunters. This is what I believe. At least the effect of it is different.
I have one last question before we open it out to everyone else. It's about the soundtrack and how you come with that, because I saw Mogwai sort of plays on the end, and yeah, there seems some interesting choices there. How did you approach that?
The first piece of music you hear, he's a brilliant British guitarist actually, and Rick Tomlinson. I mean, I like this kind of music, and I want to use it. And there was discussion between me and my colleagues in Turkey that they don't want to use music because they thought it's not cool, which I'm totally against that. I mean, there are brilliant filmmakers, and they are using music, and it works really well. I like to hear a good soundtrack with the film. I mean, it depends on what kind of film you are working on. I mean, the next year you could do something else, and you thought that, okay, only ambient sound could work with this one, and I'm not using. You could make this kind of decisions, but I like this kind of music. I like this kind of psychedelic reverbs and guitars, and this kind of piece of music also reminds us a lot some Kurdish music, which called denkbeş. That kind of repetition in the music, and it's really fit with the subject itself. And we tried few things. Then we decided to use guitar because this is not the kind of film that you could hear electronic music or some other instrument. I think whenever I think about this film, I always hear guitar, so I use guitar.
And obviously you're using the images, found images. We're using found sounds as well for...
No. I mean, of course, we use ambient of the location itself too, but 90% of the sounds we made it much later. Once we traveled to Southeast, able to record some ambient sounds actually, or people or some, chaos. Sound is most of, I think, yes, it took like 40% of the editing process. It was sound. We spent a lot of time working on that.
Open up questions to the floor if anybody has anything they'd like to ask. Just at the back up there, there's a mic as well.
Hello there. Thank you so much for this film and experience that you shared with us. I have two questions. One is slightly political and the other one more poetic, and they both relate to language. And I was curious how Kurdish language is used. My impression is it may be used as an effective instrument in protecting their cultural sovereignty and memory. In their ongoing struggles. Is language as a nonviolent instrument, is that under threat in this area, or does that seem to be a fairly stable ground? And what are interesting ways in which they use language to maintain this? And the more poetic question refers to the scene where one of the characters was listing words that were poisonous and positive, hoping to not forget them. Is there a particular Kurdish word you'd like to share with us that may be difficult to translate, or that may not have a clear equivalent in another language?
Second one is really difficult.
Go for the first.
Let me start with the second one. I write in Turkish, and Ebru, my main protagonist, she could write in Kurdish, but she could also speak 5 different kind of Kurdish. But we decided to use the one that could understood within the whole Kurdish region. Kurdish is a really strange language that sometimes they, neighbor cities could not understand each other. There's this kind of different dialects is going on. I don't believe that Kurdish language is under threat. The Kurdish don't care about that. They just speak Kurdish, and it's there. And it was like that in the, some period in the 90s. It was a big discussion were going on. But I also believe that the Turkish government has no issues with that, and it's being used by the community itself, and nobody questions that. but as an element we used in those scenes that she was feeling that when you erase those neighborhoods or the culture there in places like Cizre or Sur, she felt that they are erasing the identity itself or psyche of the language itself. So that's why she's writing. We improvised that scene. That she was writing really, you know, ordinary words, and she was connecting the dots, and she was reminding herself her favorite words in Kurdish, because it's a beautiful language. It's a really archetype language, and it's really beautiful. And the word you mentioned, she called poisonous, is actually control. She called the language word control is very poisonous, which I also believe that too. When people talk about a lot of control, it became poisonous.
And the first question.
I think I answered first question too, right? Yeah. Okay.
Just checking. Anyone else? Oh, yes, at the back.
I've seen the film before, and I watched it again tonight, and I thought it was mind-blowing the first time, and I really loved it tonight too, because I thought there was this fever about it that I didn't really notice so much the first time. There was a sense of like the urgency is about a fever that everyone seems to be part of in the film, and it makes it such an underground film in a way, and it's something that it's almost visceral. This sense of something that that needs to emerge. You know, that it's and it's almost a contained explosion all the time, but you see a lot of it, but it's contained, and then the meteors liberate all this energy. And I wanted to ask you about the bad spell that is casted on the community. This idea of the bad spell that Ebru also mentions, and that the kid mentions in one of the interview. Was it something that he mentioned, or was it something that was talked about?
Actually, in the community, elders, old people were mentioning that bad spell a lot. When you walk around Cizre or Sur, or I mean, even when you talk a walk, and when you see an old lady or some elder from the family, they were saying that there's a bad spell between the state and the Kurdish, and they cannot make peace, and this being used so often that kids also start talking about it, and the meteors comes after that actually, and then they start talking that stones started to fall because there was a bad spell, and I liked this paganic aspect of Kurdish culture actually, and there is this non-Islamic sense in their language and ordinary life, that they had these habits comes from the past, and of course they are trying to tell you that there is a war and there are killings and on both sides, and this caused this bad spell. They cannot explain you in a logical way, but that paganic aspect also inside of the film. That's why we were shooting, when we were editing that scene, I left it there, because it's being used by the whole neighborhoods over there, and things happened in those neighborhoods. It cast a bad spell, and that's why. And he's saying the little boy is saying in a really funny way, and and he used it like 60 times. Whenever when you turn the camera to him, he's saying there's a bad spell, and because he keep hearing from the elders all the time. This also, of course, these also. I use all of these elements in the film in able to prepare the audience that there's something supernatural coming on, and because I try to edit this film in a way, playful way, that very real and banal and supernatural things happening at the same time, and that's why we use this kind of superstitious and paganic elements in the film.
It's interesting when you talk about the editing. Sort of one thing that struck me was obviously some of the scenes of the sort of traditional poetic documentary kind of style are very long takes, and then other times it's sort of very short little bursts, which I thought was quite interesting. It always kind of kept you slightly on your toes. You weren't sort of sure what's sort of coming. It kind of added to that sort of sense of, I guess, disorientation that you have throughout the film in a way. I don't know if that was intentional.
I think these kind of decisions comes with the content itself, that I made the decision that this film shouldn't be slow, even though it could be slow for some other audience. But for me, it's a fast film. It's a fast-paced film, especially with the urban war scenes. Because everything was happening so sudden, and you cannot know what's gonna happen next, and I also wanted to capture this immediacy with the camera. I usually don't like to use this zoom in, zoom outs and stuff like that, but somehow it worked within the language of the film, and again, it was unconscious completely. I just thought that it's worked, and I left it there. It's a fast-paced film, but also thematically, I believe it's an experimental film, approaching the subjects. It also works well with the footage you shot is basically it's a newsreel. It looks like a newsreel. Apart from the mountain and the hunting sequences, when you come to the cities or neighborhoods, it looks like I want to capture this banality of the regular TV news channel cameras.
Any other questions? I guess, yes, I think we're done. I think we'll be having some drinks in the bar afterwards, so please come and carry on the conversation there.
Thank you.
Thank you.